That night, I was not fired. I was made a scapegoat before our family and two key investors. My uncle raised his glass, publicly handing my brainchild to his incompetent son. The table did not know I had stopped trying to save my job. I held a secret capable of sinking our tech empire. When the trial opened, the person who silenced the courtroom was not me. It was my father, speaking after 20 years of silence. I am Stella Stewart. I am 34 years old, and for the last 48 hours, I had been breathing nothing but stale coffee and recycled server room air. Tonight, however, the air smelled of roasted duck, expensive Pinot Noir, and the crisp autumn wind blowing off Lake Oakhaven. We were gathered at my uncle's sprawling waterfront estate in Virginia, a monstrous glass and cedar mansion that served as the unofficial headquarters for Northvale Meridian Systems' corporate celebrations. It was a dinner meant to honor the successful deployment of our new predictive operations system. Half the people at this long mahogany table were family. The other half were the board of directors. I should have been exhausted, but adrenaline was still burning through my veins. As the lead AI reliability engineer, I was the one who had caught the catastrophic memory leak in the core neural network just 3 hours before the biggest investor demonstration in our company's history. While the executive team was busy picking out their ties, I was buried in the back end, tearing out corrupted weight distributions and patching the prediction logic. I saved the system. I saved the demo. I saved the company millions of dollars. As I sat there, tracing the rim of my wine glass, I foolishly allowed myself to believe that tonight would be the night I finally earned my place. Not as a niece, not as a charity case, but as an equal. Then, my uncle, Victor Stewart, stood up. Victor was our chief technology officer, a man who wore his authority like a tailored suit. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp high notes cut through the low murmur of conversation, commanding immediate silence. The board members turned their heads respectfully. My parents, seated across from me, immediately straightened their postures. Family, friends, esteemed members of the board, Victor began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. We are here to celebrate a milestone. Northvale Meridian Systems has just secured a future that will redefine medical logistics forecasting. The demonstration today was nothing short of spectacular. Polite applause rippled down the table. I offered a tired but genuine smile, waiting for the pivot. I expected a brief acknowledgement of my team's frantic overnight rescue. Instead, Victor's eyes locked onto mine, and the warmth in his face vanished, replaced by a calculating, reptilian coldness. But a company built for the future cannot be weighed down by the inefficiencies of its past. As we scale this artificial intelligence architecture, we require leadership that understands robust deployment, not just chaotic, last-minute fixes. Therefore, effective immediately, I am initiating a leadership restructuring within the Predictive Artificial Intelligence Division. The air in the room grew suddenly heavy. I stopped tracing my glass. I am proud to announce, Victor continued, gesturing to his right, that my son, Grant, will be stepping in as the new Director of Artificial Intelligence Operations, overseeing the complete rollout of the predictive framework. The whole room seemed to inhale at once, and my breath caught in my throat. Grant Stewart was sitting next to his father, wearing a smug, practiced grin. Grant had been at Northvale for exactly 8 months. He was a man who routinely failed to explain even the most basic mechanics of our machine learning models to the junior developers. During his last technical pitch, he had frozen so badly I had to step in and answer every single question from the engineering team. Handing him my project was not just an insult, it was operational suicide. Before I could even process the absurdity of the announcement, a thick manila folder slid across the polished mahogany, stopping exactly in front of my plate. The corporate counsel, a man who had not spoken a word all evening, had quietly pushed it toward me. I opened the cover. The documents inside were legally binding and brutally clear. The top page was an updated non-compete agreement, effectively barring me from working in the tech sector for 5 years. Beneath that was a formal admission of guilt, explicitly stating that I was stepping down due to my own substandard testing protocols, effectively blaming me for the very crisis I had just stayed awake for 2 days to prevent. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. Victor sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment designed for the board members. "It is a transition plan, Stella. You built a fine prototype, but the enterprise phase requires a steady hand. You took reckless risks with the testing environment. We are generously allowing you to quietly step back before those mistakes cost our investors." He was rewriting reality right in front of me. He was stealing my architecture, giving it to his incompetent son, and forcing me to sign a confession that would ruin my professional reputation forever. "I fixed the system, Victor," I said, dropping the formal titles. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The testing environment was compromised because Grant bypassed the security protocols last week to push his broken user interface update. I have the server logs to prove it." Grant's face flushed deep red, but Victor did not miss a beat. He leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the table. When he spoke next, his voice dropped an octave, weaponizing a piece of family history he kept sharpened for moments exactly like this. "Stella," Victor said, his tone dripping with poisonous paternalism, "we do not need to make this ugly. Think of where you come from. Think of where your family would be if I had not intervened. 20 years ago, your father sat in a room much like this one, completely bankrupt, his business ruined. I stepped in. I paid off his debts. I put a roof over your head and eventually gave you a career here at Northvale. You owe everything you have to this family's grace. Do not repay a lifetime of generosity with insubordination." My eyes darted across the table to my father. Daniel. He was staring down at his plate, his hands resting limply in his lap. The man who had once built brilliant medical sensors from scratch was reduced to a ghost, chained to a 20-year-old debt that Victor never let anyone forget. He did not look up. He did not defend me. He just sat there, carrying the invisible weight of Victor's alleged salvation. Beside him, my mother, Elaine, reached across the table. Her fingers were trembling as she grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly tight, desperate. "Stella, please," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. Her eyes pleaded with me, begging me to surrender. "Just apologize. Sign the papers. Do not make a mess of things. We cannot afford a fight with him. You know what he did for us?" I looked at my mother's terrified face. I looked at my father's bowed head. For my entire life, this narrative had governed our existence. We were the charity cases. Victor was the savior. Every success I had ever achieved was framed as a byproduct of his mercy. He used this mythical debt to control us, to enforce compliance, and now, to steal my life's work. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my chest. All the exhaustion, all the anger, suddenly crystallized into a terrifying absolute clarity. I realized in that fraction of a second that Victor expected me to cry. He expected me to argue, to plead, to throw a tantrum in front of the board so he could point and declare me emotionally unstable. He expected the old, invisible chains of family guilt to hold me down. I gently pulled my wrist out of my mother's grasp. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The scraping of the wood against the floor sounded like a gunshot in the silent dining room. I did not look at the board of directors. I did not look at Grant, who was nervously adjusting his collar. I looked dead into Victor's eyes. "If you want my job," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that seemed to freeze the air between us, "you will have to take everything that comes with it." I turned my back on the table, walked out of the dining room, and left the mansion. The morning sun had barely breached the horizon when my phone began its relentless vibration against the oak nightstand. It was exactly 6:15 in the morning. I did not need to look at the screen to know who was fracturing the early dawn silence. By the time I finally poured my first cup of black coffee at 7 o'clock, there were 14 missed calls and 29 frantic text messages. Every single one of them was from Grant. His initial messages attempted a tone of casual authority, demanding I grant him immediate administrative access to the predictive model dashboard. By the 12th message, the facade had completely crumbled into sheer panic. He could not log into the compliance and audit reporting tier. The architecture I had built was structurally complex, relying on a series of nested authentication protocols that locked out anyone who did not understand the underlying security framework. Grant was trying to force his way into the vault with a plastic toy key, and the system was actively rejecting him. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping the bitter coffee, watching his name flash across my screen again. I felt no urge to answer. The adrenaline from the previous night had metabolized into a cold, absolute focus. I was operating purely on strategy now. Let him drown in his own incompetence for a few hours. Instead of replying to his increasingly desperate pleas, I opened my personal laptop and drafted a highly precise, meticulously worded email. The recipients were the head of human resources and the chief legal officer of Northvale. I formally confirmed my immediate withdrawal from the predictive AI project, citing the structural leadership changes announced the previous evening. But the core of the email was not a resignation. It was a formal legal directive. I explicitly requested an immediate and comprehensive data retention hold on all server logs, commit histories, and system access records associated with the project for the past 18 months. I cited standard compliance preservation protocols, ensuring that no one could scrub the digital footprint of who touched what and exactly when they did it. I hit send. The digital trap was set. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, the caller identification displayed the Executive Suite extension. It was Victor. I answered on the third ring, letting the silence stretch across the line before he spoke. "You are making a very foolish mistake," Victor said. His voice lacked the theatrical warmth from the dinner. It was a low, abrasive growl, stripped of all pretense. "Grant tells me he is locked out of the primary diagnostic interface. You will log in right now, walk him through the administrative bypass, and initiate the formal handover." "I no longer have authorization to interact with that tier of the system," I replied, my voice flat and even. 5. You reassigned the project. The transition of technical debt is now the responsibility of the new director. I could hear his breath hitch with sudden rage. "Do not play semantics with me. If you do not report to the office by 9 o'clock this morning to support this transition, I will permanently withhold your quarterly performance bonus. It is a substantial sum, and I know you need it. Furthermore, I will personally ensure the narrative surrounding your departure reflects the truth, that you abandoned a critical infrastructure project mid-crisis because you could not handle the pressure." He was trying to corner me with financial ruin and reputational destruction. It was his classic playbook, the same one he had used to hollow out my father 2 decades ago. But Victor had fundamentally miscalculated my position. He assumed I was as vulnerable as my family had been back then. He did not know about the emergency fund I had quietly built. Holding exactly 8 months of living expenses in a high-yield account he could not touch. He did not know about the independent consulting contract waiting in my private inbox, ready to be signed the moment I officially severed ties. Most importantly, he did not know about Mara Ellison, a ruthless corporate labor attorney who already possessed a preliminary dossier of my situation and was eagerly waiting for my signal to strike. "Do whatever you feel is necessary, Victor," I said smoothly, and then I ended the call. I did not throw the phone. I did not scream. I walked into my home office, locked the door, and began the real work. For the next 4 hours, the world outside ceased to exist. I accessed my encrypted external drive, which contained legally retained, sanitized copies of the internal technical reports I had prepared over the last year. As the lead engineer, keeping personal backups of my own diagnostic evaluations before they went to the executive committee was standard, compliant practice. I opened a massive spreadsheet on my left monitor and pulled up the finalized board presentations on the right. I began a line-by-line forensic comparison. I was not looking for code errors. I was looking for narrative shifts. It took exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes to find the first anomaly. The discrepancy was buried deep within the risk assessment matrix for our largest client, the regional hospital network. In my original technical report, submitted exactly 3 weeks prior, my team had flagged a severe predictive deviation metric. The artificial intelligence model was hallucinating supply chain shortages in the critical care wing at a rate of roughly 12%. It was a glaring red flag that required immediate recalibration before deployment. However, the final document presented to the board of directors, the exact same document Victor had used to secure the next phase of venture funding, showed a deviation metric of less than 1%. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I pulled up the metadata for the finalized report. I cross-referenced the digital signature timestamp with the system modification logs I had saved. The technical warnings had not simply been ignored or misunderstood. They had been deliberately, surgically erased. I dug deeper, opening 5 more deployment reports from the past 3 quarters. The pattern repeated itself flawlessly. Every time my engineering team flagged a critical system vulnerability that might delay a lucrative contract signing, the numbers in the final board presentation were miraculously smoothed out. The risk was sanitized. Then, I found the smoking gun. Every single alteration, every deleted warning, and every falsified metric had been executed and approved using a specific digital token. It was an executive override account. In the entire corporate hierarchy of Northvale Meridian Systems, that supreme level of system bypass privilege belonged exclusively to the office of the Chief Technology Officer. The realization washed over me like ice water. I sat back in my chair, staring at the damning evidence illuminating the dark room. This was never about Grant needing a promotion. This was never just about a petty uncle stealing his niece's credit to bolster his own legacy. Victor knew the predictive model was fundamentally flawed because he had actively prevented me from fixing it by hiding the errors from the board. He had secured millions in funding based on fraudulent performance data. And when the system inevitably crashed during the massive rollout, a crash that would trigger an immediate audit from the hospital network and the federal regulators, Victor needed someone else standing in the blast radius. He had handed the project to Grant not to reward him, but to trigger the final phase of the transition. He had pushed that non-compete and admission of guilt across the dining table, so I would legally sign my name to the very substandard testing protocols he had secretly orchestrated. He was meticulously building a paper trail to frame me for the entire corporate fraud. I looked at the blinking cursor on my screen. Victor thought he was burying a naive engineer under an avalanche of corporate bureaucracy. He did not realize he had just handed the shovel to the only person who knew exactly where all his bodies were buried. The glow of the dual monitors cast long, harsh shadows across my empty living room. I stared at the falsified audit logs, but the numbers blurred, replaced by the ghost of a memory I had spent my entire adult life trying to outrun. To understand the trap my uncle had just sprung, you had to understand the invisible cage my family had lived in for over 2 decades. Long before Northvale Meridian Systems became a corporate behemoth, my father, Daniel Stewart, was a man who built things with his hands. In the late 90s, he co-founded a modest workshop specializing in biometric medical sensors. I still remember the smell of that place. It was a potent mix of soldering iron rosin, ozone, and burnt coffee. My father used to be vibrant, full of frantic, brilliant energy, sketching circuit board schematics on napkins during dinner. Then came the financial collapse. I was only a teenager when the workshop went under, so the details were always kept from me. But the aftermath became the defining mythology of our family. Victor, who was just a mid-level venture capitalist at the time, swooped in. He provided the capital to clear the workshop's debts and absorbed the remaining assets into his own burgeoning tech portfolio. From that day forward, Victor told exactly one version of the story. He had reached into his own pocket to rescue his brother from total ruin. He had saved us from the street. He had given us a new life. And the cost of that salvation was absolute, unwavering loyalty. It was a narrative Victor cultivated with the precision of a master gardener tending a poisonous plant. He watered it at every Thanksgiving dinner, reminding everyone how he had pulled Daniel from the brink. He pruned it at every family gathering, ensuring my parents always took the subordinate seats, always spoke softly, always deferred to his judgment. The debt was never paid off because Victor never wanted his money back. He wanted ownership. Because of that story, my father fundamentally changed. The brilliant engineer who used to let me solder scrap wire on his workbench vanished. In his place stood a quiet, hollowed-out man who walked with his shoulders permanently hunched, as if anticipating a blow. Whenever I complained about Victor's overbearing nature, my father would pull me aside, his eyes pleading. He would tell me to keep my head down. He would whisper that I must never confront my uncle at the company. We owed him too much, my father would say. We could never rock the boat. I hated that boat. I spent my 20s proving I did not need Victor's charity. I paid for my own university tuition by working double shifts at a campus library. I spent 4 years grinding through advanced calculus and machine learning algorithms. When I applied to Northvale, I submitted my resume blindly, passing 3 grueling technical interviews under an assumed variation of my name to ensure no one knew my lineage. I earned my position through raw, undeniable competence. But the moment human resources processed my onboarding paperwork, Victor claimed the victory. He paraded me around the engineering floor, loudly proclaiming how happy he was to give his niece a leg up in the industry. Every late night I worked, every complex neural network I debugged, every promotion I earned through sheer exhaustion was instantly reframed by Victor as the result of family patronage. He made sure every vice president and board member believed I was only occupying my chair because of his benevolence. He used that manufactured gratitude as a brutal management tool. If an engineer questioned his unrealistic deployment schedules, Victor would invoke family loyalty, forcing me to side with him or look like an ungrateful traitor. He used our supposed debt to justify promoting his son, Grant, over far more qualified senior developers. He weaponized the concept of thankfulness to silence any professional dissent I dared to raise regarding the safety of our predictive models. Yet, whenever I tried to interrogate the origins of this endless servitude, I hit a brick wall. Over the years, I had begged my father to explain the actual mechanics of his bankruptcy. I wanted to know the numbers. I wanted to know the terms. But my father would just shake his head, his face pale and exhausted. He would look at me with a mixture of deep sorrow and paralyzing fear, and he would always repeat the exact same phrase. There are prices I have already paid. Stella, do not pay them again. His silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It made me furious. I was angry at his submission, angry at his refusal to stand up and reclaim his dignity. But beneath that anger was a profound, aching pity. I knew my father was a good man. I knew he loved me, which meant whatever he was hiding, whatever happened during that buyout 20 years ago, was dark enough to break the spirit of the strongest man I had ever known. I blinked, pulling myself back to the present. The digital clock on my taskbar read 2:14 in the morning. My coffee had gone completely cold. I looked back at the glowing screens, the falsified risk assessments, the scrubbed safety warnings, the executive overrides authorizing the deceit. Victor was doing to me exactly what he had done to my father. He was manufacturing a crisis, positioning himself as the untouchable authority, and preparing to use a forged narrative to destroy my career while demanding my gratitude for not throwing me in jail. He was using the past to lock my future. He was relying on the assumption that I would fold, just like my father had folded, because fighting back would mean dragging our family's ugly history into the light. He thought the shame of the past was my weakness. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room. If Victor wanted to use the past as a cage, I was not going to waste my time arguing with him through the bars. I was going to tear the floorboards up. My father had fought with silence and submission, hoping to protect me. I would fight with data. I would fight with compliance logs, legal holds, and the cold, unyielding truth of forensic accounting. I opened a new, encrypted search terminal on my secondary monitor. Before I could dismantle his current fraud, I needed to understand the foundation of his power. I needed to know exactly what he stole from my father 2 decades ago. I typed in the access credentials for the deepest, most archaic layer of the corporate digital archives. I was going hunting. By Tuesday afternoon, the tactical silence from the executive suite shattered, replaced by a meticulously orchestrated character assassination. Victor did not just want me gone, he needed me radioactive. It started with a slow, toxic drip through the human resources department. Former colleagues, engineers I had mentored for over 3 years, began sending me hesitant, encrypted messages. They asked if I was feeling well. They mentioned that the director of human resources had held a closed-door meeting with the remaining predictive operations team, heavily implying that I had suffered a severe emotional collapse and abruptly abandoned my post right in the middle of a critical compliance audit. Victor was painting me as a hysterical, unstable woman who cracked under the pressure of enterprise deployment. Then came the public phase. At exactly 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning, Grant published a highly visible update on the largest professional networking platform. He did not use my name, but the implication was a blunt force instrument. He wrote about the challenges of leadership transitions and the burden of inheriting unmanageable technical debt. He explicitly praised his new developers for working through the night to untangle what he called opaque and undocumented legacy code left behind by former personnel. He framed himself as the tireless cleaner, sweeping up the disastrous mess of a rogue engineer. The post garnered hundreds of likes from Northvale executives and vendors within the first 2 hours. My first instinct was visceral, blinding rage. I wanted to draft a public rebuttal, attach the raw system logs proving Grant could not even write a basic sorting algorithm, and burn his fabricated reputation to the ground. But I forced my hands away from the keyboard. Reacting emotionally was exactly what Victor was banking on. He wanted me to look erratic. The real blow, however, landed on Thursday morning. For the past 6 months, I had been quietly laying the groundwork for my own independent data analytics startup. I had a crucial preliminary pitch scheduled for Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning with a prominent regional venture capital fund. It was my exit strategy, my chance to build something entirely free from the shadow of my family's alleged debt. At 9:15 on Thursday, my inbox chimed. It was a brief, sterile email from the senior partner at the venture fund. The meeting was indefinitely suspended. The partner stated that their legal compliance team had received a highly concerning, anonymous dossier. The anonymous sender accused me of unlawfully duplicating Northvale Meridian Systems' proprietary algorithms and attempting to repackage their intellectual property for my new venture. I immediately picked up the phone and dialed Mara Ellison. Mara was a corporate labor attorney who operated with the cold, mechanical precision of a scalpel. 5. When I read the venture fund's email aloud to her, she did not gasp. She simply sighed, the sound crackling over the cellular connection. "They are boxing you in," Mara said, her tone devoid of sympathy but heavy with tactical calculation. "This is standard corporate warfare playbook. Chapter 1. Your uncle knows that if you file a wrongful termination or whistleblower suit, the first thing a judge will look at is your credibility. By seeding rumors of emotional instability and planting anonymous accusations of intellectual property theft, Victor is constructing a preemptive narrative. He is building a permanent file on your professional ethics. If we go to court now, their defense will simply be that you are a disgruntled, unethical former employee seeking revenge for a justified termination. So what do? I asked, pacing the length of my living room. I cannot just let them destroy my name in the industry. That venture capital meeting was my lifeline. You do exactly nothing in public, Mara instructed firmly. No social media posts. No angry emails to your old team. Silence is your armor right now. We do not fight the rumors. We investigate the mechanics of the smear. Every anonymous letter leaves a trail. Someone had to compile those allegations. Someone had to physically mail it or route it through a proxy server. We are going to lock down the timeline. I need you to document every single interaction you had with the company servers in your final 48 hours. We need to prove it was technically impossible for you to steal that code. I spent the next 24 hours doing exactly as Mara ordered, painstakingly reconstructing my digital footprint. But the breakthrough did not come from a server log. It came from a burner phone. It was nearly midnight on Friday when an unknown number flashed on my screen. I hesitated, then answered. Stella? The voice was a harsh, nervous whisper. It is the night shift security supervisor from the main campus. Please do not say my name out loud. I froze, immediately recognizing the slight rasp in his voice. We used to share awful vending machine coffee at 2 o'clock in the morning when I was running overnight load tests on the servers. I am here, I said quietly. What is going on? I am taking a massive risk even calling you, he stammered, his breath hitting the receiver in rapid panicked bursts. But what they are doing to you, it is not right. They are setting you up. Who is setting me up? The Chief Technology Officer, the guard replied, his voice dropping even lower. Tuesday night, just a few hours after you walked out of that dinner, Victor came into the security office. He bypassed standard human resources protocol. He ordered me to disable the overhead surveillance cameras in your sector and physically unlock your office. My blood ran completely cold. Did he go inside alone? No. He brought a private contractor with him. A digital forensics guy. They spent 3 hours in your office. I watched them pull the physical backup drive from your locked filing cabinet. The contractor hooked it up to a cloning station and copied every single file. Then they put the original drive back and wiped the access logs on the electronic door. The anonymous letter to the venture capital fund suddenly made perfect sense. Victor had not just fabricated the intellectual property theft. He had illegally seized my personal backup drive, likely manipulating the cloned data to manufacture fake evidence against me in case I tried to sue. I need you to testify to this, I said, my grip tightening on the phone. This is an illegal search and seizure. It proves the intellectual property accusation is a setup. I cannot, the guard hissed desperately. I am 2 years away from my pension. Stella, if I go on the record against Victor Stewart, he will terminate me with cause. He will ruin my retirement. I cannot be the face of this. You do not have to be the face of it, I promised, my mind racing. If my lawyer can guarantee you absolute whistleblower protection, complete legal immunity, and anonymity until the court mandates a subpoena. Will you give us the physical security handover logs? The ones Victor could not delete from the basement mainframe? There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. The tension was so thick it felt like the air in my apartment had turned to lead. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. I have the physical logbook, he finally whispered. I made a photocopy of the page before my shift ended. I will give it to your lawyer. But if they come after me, you have to protect me. We will, I said. I hung up the phone and stared out the window into the dark city. This was the turning point. For 20 years, Victor had operated like a ghost, using verbal threats, emotional manipulation, and family guilt to control his empire without ever leaving a mark. But arrogance had finally made him sloppy. He had stepped outside his carefully manicured corporate procedures. He had executed an illegal raid, and he had left physical footprints. The predator had just handed the prey a loaded weapon. We spent the next 72 hours entombed in Mara Ellison's downtown conference room. The heavy oak table vanished entirely beneath a staggering topography of printed audit logs, internal email threads, system architecture diagrams, and approval routing schedules spanning the past 18 months. The air smelled of toner and stale espresso. We were not just reading documents, we were reverse engineering a trap, examining every single detail as a potential tripwire. Mara operated with terrifying efficiency. She pinned a massive timeline to the corkboard wall, dividing it into technical realities and corporate narratives. Our objective was to chart exactly where the two diverged. The first major fracture appeared when we cross-referenced my team's raw diagnostic data with the finalized board presentations regarding the Blue Orchard Health Network. Blue Orchard was Northvale's crown jewel, a multi-state hospital conglomerate whose contract was up for a massive, multi-million-dollar renewal. I pulled up a specific cluster of reports from late last autumn. Here, I said, pointing to a highlighted column on the raw data sheet. I ran a stress test on the predictive supply chain model for 3 of their largest urban trauma centers. The demographic input data was severely skewed. The model was aggressively underpredicting the need for critical surgical supplies by roughly 15%. It was a catastrophic failure point. Mara slid the corresponding finalized board deck across the table. It was the exact presentation used to secure the Blue Orchard contract extension. I flipped to the risk assessment slide. The 15% failure rate was gone. In its place was a smooth, beautifully formatted graph showing a negligible deviation of less than 2%. They did not just ignore the risk, Mara noted, tracing the clean graph with her pen. They actively sanitized it. We dug into the internal communication logs to find out exactly how a critical system failure became a negligible blip. I found a long email chain I had initiated 9 months ago, explicitly begging the executive team to delay the Blue Orchard deployment until we could retrain the neural network with balanced data. My warnings were blunt, technical, and undeniable. However, the routing history showed that my emails never reached the compliance committee. Instead, they were intercepted, tagged with a systemic label reading consolidated for executive review, and then permanently buried. Look at the authorization footprint on the final, beautified reports, I told Mara, pulling up the digital signature metadata. Every single altered document, every scrubbed warning, bore the cryptographic stamp of the Chief Technology Officer's executive suite. What made it entirely sickening was the video archive of the quarterly shareholder meetings. We watched the footage of Grant standing confidently in front of the board of directors, clicking through the slide deck filled with those exact falsified numbers. He used the smooth, risk-free metrics to showcase his supposed leadership and technical acumen. He was parading a ticking time bomb as his own personal masterpiece, completely insulated by his father's systematic erasure of the truth. But the most devastating revelation did not come from the artificial intelligence project. It emerged from a dusty, forgotten digital directory labeled under legacy legal acquisitions. Mara, possessing the instincts of a bloodhound, had quietly requested the original financial instruments tying my family to Northvale during the initial discovery phase. She wanted to establish a pattern of Victor's coercive behavior. What she found was a 200-page PDF of the buyout agreement for my father's medical sensor workshop from 2 decades ago. Mara spread the printed pages of the old contract across the remaining open space on the table. She did not look at the text. She looked at the geometry of the paper. I had an independent forensic document examiner run a pixel density analysis on this scan, Mara said, her voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. Look at the notary stamps and the margin alignments. She pointed to the first dozen pages. Pages 1 through 14 have a uniform scan degradation, perfectly consistent with the optical character recognition software used in the late 90s. The ink bleed and paper texture match seamlessly. She then pointed to a page near the end of the document. But page 15, which contains the absolute asset forfeiture clause and the transfer of intellectual property, is entirely different. The pixel density is sharper. The microscopic alignment of the text is off by a fraction of a millimeter. The file property metadata buried deep in the archive shows that this specific digital page was inserted into the master file exactly 4 years after the original document was signed and notarized. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You are saying the contract in the company archives is a forgery. I am saying the original agreement your father signed was likely a standard high-interest bailout loan, Mara corrected, her eyes locking onto mine. But Victor swapped the pages later to make it look like your father willingly surrendered everything he owned. This was not a rescue. It was a hostile takeover masked as family charity, executed through fraudulent document manipulation. Mara leaned back, folding her hands together. The room suddenly felt incredibly small. Stella, you are standing at a crossroads, she said clearly. Option 1. We use the falsified AI reports to file a standard wrongful termination and defamation lawsuit. We hold the Blue Orchard fraud over Victor's head, force a massive, quiet settlement, restore your professional reputation, and you walk away tomorrow to start your new company. It is fast, it is safe, and it guarantees your future." She paused, letting the weight of the alternative settle in the room. Option 2. We include the legacy acquisition forgery and file a massive corporate fraud and racketeering case. We blow the whistle to the federal regulators regarding the hospital contracts. It will not be quiet. It will be a bloodbath. It will drag on for years. It will destroy Northvale's stock, and it will force your father onto a witness stand to testify about the darkest period of his life. You will be declaring open war on your entire family. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking down at the crawling city traffic. The safe option was right there. I could take the money, clear my name, and finally be free of Victor. But then I turned back to the table and picked up the final section of the legacy file, a supplementary appendix that Mara had set aside. I scanned the archaic legal text, my eyes stopping dead on a specific line item. It was a patent transfer agreement for a revolutionary biometric sensor algorithm. The patent was registered solely under the name Daniel Stewart. My breath caught in my throat. My father had never mentioned this patent to me. He had never once told me that he was the sole inventor of the foundational architecture that Northvale eventually built its entire multi-billion-dollar hardware division upon. Victor had not just stolen my father's business. He had stolen his genius, erased his legacy, and then convinced him he should be grateful for the privilege of surviving. I carefully placed the paper back on the table. I thought about my father, sitting quietly at dinner, head bowed, carrying a manufactured shame for 20 years. I looked at Mara. Her pen was poised over her legal pad, waiting for my directive. "We are not settling," I said, my voice completely steady. "Draft the comprehensive suit. We are burning it all down." The legal war did not begin with a loud explosion. It began with the quiet, methodical placement of stones on a board. Mara executed our first move on Monday morning. She filed an emergency injunction in the district court, legally compelling Northvale Meridian Systems to enact a strict litigation hold. This mandate meant every corporate server, every localized hard drive, and every single employee email account was instantly frozen under the threat of severe federal obstruction charges if a single byte of data was deleted or altered. Simultaneously, she drafted a razor-sharp rebuttal to the venture capital fund that had paused my startup pitch. The letter did not plead for understanding. It promised devastating legal action against any entity participating in a coordinated campaign of tortious interference and defamation. I deliberately kept the scope of our initial legal filings incredibly narrow. There were no public press conferences, no dramatic accusations of corporate fraud leaked to the technology blogs. I needed Victor to believe he was still playing a simple, manageable game of human resources chess. I wanted him to think my absolute only goal was to clear my name of Grant's fabricated coding errors and salvage my independent consulting prospects. If Victor thought I was only fighting for my personal reputation, he would aggressively guard his public relations flank while leaving his financial and compliance flanks completely exposed to our eventual strike. The strategy worked beautifully. The silence made them nervous, but it also made them careless. On Wednesday afternoon, the first major crack in Victor's supposedly impenetrable armor appeared. Mara received a heavily encrypted communication through a secure legal portal. It was not from the company's corporate counsel. It was from the private defense attorney of a senior board member who had been sitting right across from me at that long mahogany table during the fateful celebration dinner. This specific board member was the individual who had officially authorized the massive hospital infrastructure rollout based on the sanitized risk assessments. He was not calling to offer an apology. He was terrified. If it could be proven in a court of law that the technical reports had been surgically altered before he signed them, he would be held personally liable for defrauding shareholders and endangering public health. He wanted to know, strictly off the record, if Mara possessed tangible, undeniable evidence that the data had been manipulated prior to reaching the executive committee. Mara, playing the legal game perfectly, gave his attorney just enough information to confirm his worst fears without revealing our full hand. She advised his lawyer to tell his client to retain independent criminal defense counsel immediately. The unified front of the board was beginning to fracture. By Thursday morning, Victor realized the litigation hold was not a temporary bluff. He could no longer rely on his night shift security guards to secretly scrub his digital footprints. He needed to neutralize me before the formal discovery phase allowed Mara to legally subpoena the executive override system logs. His aggressive counterattack arrived in the form of a heavily watermarked settlement offer, hand-delivered by a junior associate from a massive corporate law firm. Victor was offering a quiet, internal resolution. The terms were superficially very generous. Northvale would immediately pay out my full quarterly performance bonus, plus an additional lump sum equal to exactly 2 years of my current base salary. Furthermore, I would be given a newly created, highly prestigious title of Vice President of Advanced Research, stationed at a completely new satellite office over 2,000 miles away in Seattle. I would have an impressive operating budget and absolute autonomy. The poison, of course, was buried deep within the conditions. To accept the money and the new title, I had to sign a draconian non-disclosure agreement. I had to permanently withdraw the litigation hold, waive my right to any future whistleblower claims, and formally acknowledge in writing that my departure from the predictive artificial intelligence project was a mutual, entirely amicable transition. Victor was not offering a peace treaty. He was trying to buy a very expensive permanent gag order. I sat in Mara's downtown office, looking down at the crisp, legally binding document. It represented millions of dollars and a guaranteed escape from the immediate, overwhelming chaos. "Reject it," I said, sliding the heavy folder back across the desk. "Do not even offer a counterproposal. Just send a single sentence stating that the plaintiff unequivocally declines the terms." Mara smiled, a sharp, predatory expression crossing her face. "Victor is going to interpret a flat rejection without a counteroffer as a sign that you are just holding out for a much larger financial payout. He will think you are getting greedy." "Let him think exactly that," I replied, feeling a cold calm wash over me. "The longer he believes this is just a petty negotiation over a dollar amount, the less he will suspect we are quietly building a massive criminal fraud case against him." That evening, I was sitting alone on my living room floor, surrounded by printed system architectures and highlighted timelines, when there was a soft, incredibly hesitant knock at my front door. It was my father. Daniel stood in the hallway, looking older and vastly more fragile than he had at the dinner party just a few nights ago. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by days of sleepless anxiety. He stepped inside slowly, his eyes scanning the absolute chaos of legal pads and documentation scattered across my rug. He did not offer any polite small talk. He did not ask if I had eaten dinner. He stood by the kitchen counter, his hands gripping the edge of the cold granite tightly. "Your mother told me Victor offered you a settlement today," he said, his voice barely hovering above a whisper. "She said it was a lot of money. She said you turned it down without even reading the whole thing." "I did," I answered, standing up to face him directly. "The money was a bribe to cover up what he has been doing to the hospital contracts. And to cover up what he did to you." My father physically flinched. He looked away, staring intensely at a blank spot on the wall. The heavy silence between us stretched tight, filled to the brim with 20 years of unspoken resentments and buried truths. When he finally looked back at me, his eyes were shining with heavy, unshed tears. "Stella," he began, his voice cracking painfully under the sheer weight of the question. "If you dig up the past, if you really drag all of this ugly history out into the light, will you be able to bear it when you find out that your father stayed silent for so long? Will you be able to look at me every day knowing I let him do this to our family because I was simply too weak to fight back?" The raw, devastating vulnerability in his voice completely shattered the lingering anger I had carried for him all these years. I crossed the room and gently placed my hands over his trembling fingers. "I do not need you to be a perfect father," I told him, my voice firm and entirely clear. "I do not need you to be a fearless hero who never made a mistake. I just need you to stand on the side of the truth. Just this once. I cannot fight the ghost of what happened 20 years ago if you keep fiercely protecting the man who haunts us." He looked at me for a very long time. The deeply ingrained fear that had defined his posture for 2 decades seemed to waver, replaced by a slow, agonizing realization of his own complicity. He slowly pulled his hands from mine, gave a single, tight nod, and walked out the door without uttering another word. I did not know what to expect. I truly thought I might have pushed him too far, forcing him to confront a painful reality he simply could not survive emotionally. But later that exact same night, in the damp, quiet darkness of his own garage, Daniel did not retreat into his usual submission. He walked past his neatly organized toolboxes and reached high up into the dusty, cobwebbed rafters. He pulled down an old, rusted metal lockbox that had not seen the light of day since the late 90s. He carried it into his private study, the cold metal heavy against his hands. He broke the small brass padlock with a pair of heavy pliers. Inside the box lay the true, unaltered history of our family. There were leather-bound ledger notebooks filled with his meticulous handwriting, thoroughly documenting the actual, massive valuation of his biometric algorithms before the crash. There was a thick stack of original certified bank letters, proving he had successfully secured alternative financing right before the buyout was forced upon him. And resting securely at the very bottom, wrapped carefully in a protective layer of yellowed cloth, was a mini audio cassette tape. It was a fragile, analog recording he had hidden away for over 20 years, capturing the exact moment the supposed savior of our family revealed himself to be a ruthless extortionist. My father sat heavily at my kitchen island, the shattered brass padlock resting beside the open metal box. He did not say a single word as I carefully lifted the fragile, yellowed documents into the harsh overhead light. The very first paper was a carbon copy of the original drafting agreement between Daniel Stewart and his brother. I read the clauses twice, my eyes tracing the faded type. According to this initial contract, my father was never supposed to surrender his company entirely. The terms clearly stipulated that he would retain 40% equity in the merged entity, along with absolute ownership of the core biometric patent he had engineered. I pulled the forged digital scan Mara and I had found in the corporate archives and laid it right next to my father's carbon copy. The contrast was a violent gut punch. The officially filed version at Northvale Meridian Systems had completely erased the equity retention clause. In its place was a brutally sanitized paragraph transferring 99% of all intellectual property and voting rights directly to Victor. He swapped the signature pages, I whispered, the reality of the massive theft sinking deep into my bones. My father slowly nodded, his gaze fixed on the countertop. I signed the draft on a Tuesday. Victor took the master copies to his notary. By the time the finalized binders were mailed to me a month later, I was too exhausted to verify the page numbers. But I kept the carbon. I reached back into the box and pulled out the miniature audio cassette. My father pushed a battery-operated dictaphone toward me. I snapped the tape in and pressed play. There was a long stretch of analog hiss, followed by the clinking of glassware. Then, Victor's voice filled my kitchen. He sounded younger, but the arrogant cadence was identical. He was speaking to a man he addressed as a senior loan officer at the regional bank, holding my father's commercial debt. "You need to call the loan entirely," Victor's recorded voice instructed smoothly. "Do not offer him a grace period. Accelerate the debt covenant by Friday afternoon. Squeeze his credit line until he cannot even buy soldering wire. When he is officially insolvent, I will step in and offer to buy the distressed assets at a fraction of the cost. You get your bad debt cleared off the books, and I get the patents." I stopped the tape. My hands were shaking with pure rage. Victor had not rescued his brother from a tragic financial collapse. He had actively orchestrated the bankruptcy. "Why did you let him get away with it?" I demanded, my voice tight. "You had the tape. You had the carbon copy. You could have destroyed him 20 years ago." My father finally looked up, his eyes hollowed out by decades of suppressed grief. "I hired a lawyer. I was going to sue him for everything. But 3 days before we were scheduled to file the injunction, your mother became severely ill. She needed emergency surgery and months of aggressive treatment. I had no health insurance left. My bank accounts were frozen. Victor came to the hospital waiting room. He offered to pay every single medical bill in cash, on one condition. I had to fire my lawyer and sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the buyout. He swallowed hard. I traded my company and my dignity to keep your mother alive. And Victor made sure I spent the next 2 decades paying interest on that exact same debt. The puzzle was finally complete. Victor had weaponized my mother's illness to silence my father, just as he was currently trying to weaponize my career to cover his own corporate fraud. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. While we were arming ourselves with decades of buried evidence, the empire Victor had stolen was beginning to collapse under the weight of his own son's sheer incompetence. The very next morning, the corporate hunt accelerated in the opposite direction. Grant, utterly panicked by my refusal to silently hand over the operational keys, realized he could not keep the predictive artificial intelligence system stable. The memory leak I had patched during the dinner party was only a temporary fix, and Grant lacked the technical literacy to understand the underlying architecture. Desperate to prove his worth to the board and needing a scapegoat for his inevitable failure, Grant made a catastrophic gamble. He bypassed the internal quality assurance protocols and pushed a highly unstable, bug-ridden demonstration build of the software directly to a live client interface. His plan was incredibly transparent. He intended to let the system crash in a controlled environment, immediately draft a memo blaming my old, messy code, and then present himself as the brilliant director who was actively cleaning up my disaster. He severely underestimated the volatility of the code. At exactly 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, Grant initiated the live demonstration for a secondary logistics partner. The predictive model did not just glitch. It triggered a cascading logic failure, feeding massive streams of corrupted data directly into the client's live routing servers. The resulting outage shut down their automated dispatch system for 4 consecutive hours. It was a massive, highly visible disaster that cost the partner hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single afternoon. The board of directors did not wait for Grant to write his fabricated memo. Facing an immediate breach of contract lawsuit from the logistics partner, the board forcibly intervened. They bypassed the executive suite entirely and voted unanimously to launch a fully independent internal investigation into the artificial intelligence division. External forensic auditors were hired by 5 o'clock that same evening. The timing was absolutely immaculate. The auditors were walking into the company exactly when Mara and I had already compiled the comprehensive chain of internal emails, proving I had aggressively warned the executive suite about these exact system vulnerabilities months ago. Grant had just handed us the match to light the fuse. Victor realized he had lost control of the narrative. The independent audit meant he could no longer hide behind executive privilege. His son's catastrophic failure had blown the doors wide open. In a state of absolute desperation, Victor resorted to his oldest and most reliable tactic. He tried to choke the life out of the opposition through family intimidation. At 11:30 on Friday night, the headlights of Victor's luxury sedan cut through the darkness of my parents' quiet suburban street. I was not there, but my father told me every detail the next morning. Victor did not bother knocking. He used the spare key he had kept for years and walked right into their living room. My father was sitting in his armchair, reading. Victor stood over him, dropping all pretense of corporate polish. He looked frantic, the veins in his neck bulging. "You need to call Stella off right now," Victor demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet house. "She is dragging the entire family name through the mud with these ridiculous legal threats. If she pushes this audit, if she takes me to court, I swear to God, Daniel, I will ruin her. I will countersue for corporate espionage, and I will make sure she never works in this industry again. I saved your life. I put food in her mouth. You owe me your absolute allegiance." Victor waited for the usual response. He waited for my father to shrink into the upholstery, to apologize, to promise he would control his daughter. But the man sitting in the armchair was no longer the broken shell from the hospital waiting room. The lockbox was open. The truth was out. My father did not stand up immediately. He slowly closed his book, placing it deliberately on the side table. He looked up at the brother who had robbed him. manipulated him, and held him hostage for 20 long years. There was no fear left in his eyes, only a cold, unyielding resolve. "You did not save me, Victor," my father said, his voice remarkably steady, devoid of the tremor that had haunted him for decades. "You broke my legs and then demanded I thank you for handing me a crutch." Victor recoiled as if he had been physically struck. "You ungrateful fool. I have the signed contracts. I have the legal high ground. If you fight me, you will be the one publicly humiliated." My father finally stood up, matching his brother's height. He did not yell. He simply looked right through Victor. "Bring your contracts," my father replied softly. "Because this time, I will read the papers before I listen to you tell the story. Now get out of my house." Mara escalated the battlefield. We did not just file a single lawsuit. We launched a coordinated assault on 4 separate legal fronts. The initial filing cited wrongful termination and the creation of a hostile work environment. The second branch aggressively targeted professional defamation, demanding severe compensatory damages for the anonymous letters sent to my prospective investors. The third was a brutal claim of tortious interference with business opportunities, designed to permanently expose his sabotage of my startup. But the fourth branch was the killing blow. Mara filed a massive discovery motion demanding full access to the executive communication logs, specifically seeking tangible evidence of systemic corporate fraud regarding the hospital network safety reports. Victor's legal defense team, a battalion of wildly expensive corporate litigators, immediately attempted to shrink the narrative. They filed rapid countermotions framing the entire situation as a petty, vindictive family feud spilling into the boardroom. They leaked carefully worded statements to the local business press, painting me as a highly privileged, entitled niece who was simply throwing a malicious temper tantrum because I had rightfully lost my management position to a more capable relative. They desperately wanted the judge to view this as nepotism gone wrong, rather than a massive federal crime. The local technology sector in our Virginia hub is a surprisingly small, insular community. Within 48 hours, I could feel the temperature drop. When I walked into my usual morning coffee shop, conversations abruptly ceased. Former peers from competing firms looked away, their expressions a mix of pity and disdain. Victor had spent 2 decades building his reputation as an industry titan and a benevolent patriarch. In the court of public opinion, where people had only heard his highly polished version of events, I was already convicted of biting the hand that had generously fed my family. But the most dangerous threat to our case did not come from Victor's lawyers or the local gossip. It came from my own mother. Just 3 days before the absolute deadline to submit our finalized evidence exhibits to the court, Elaine Stewart arrived at my apartment unannounced. She looked utterly exhausted, her hands gripping her leather purse so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She sat on the edge of my sofa and began to weep, a quiet, desperate sound that tore right through my chest. "You have to stop this, Stella," she pleaded, her voice shaking violently. "You have to take whatever settlement they offer. Please." I knelt in front of her, taking her trembling hands in mine. "Mom, we have the proof. We have the audio tape and the forged contracts. We can actually win this. We can end it." "It is not about winning," she cried, shaking her head frantically. "It is about your father. Do you know what this trial will do to him? To sit in an open courtroom, with reporters and neighbors watching, and have Victor's lawyers publicly dissect his bankruptcy? To have them call him a failure on the public record? His heart cannot take that kind of humiliation again. He is finally finding some peace. If you put him on that witness stand, it will completely break him." Her terror was entirely genuine. For 20 years, Elaine had acted as my father's emotional shield, absorbing the ambient anxiety of his manufactured shame. The thought of dragging their darkest trauma into the blinding light of a public trial terrified her far more than Victor ever could. The family was standing on the absolute edge of a total fracture. For a long, agonizing hour, sitting there listening to my mother cry, I seriously considered calling Mara and telling her to pull the filings. I was willing to sacrifice my career, but I was not sure I could sacrifice my parents' fragile stability. The decision was taken out of my hands that exact same evening. My father had quietly requested to take the metal lockbox back to his own house. He locked himself in his small, dusty garage study for 6 straight hours. He sat alone in the dim light, playing the miniature audio cassette tape over and over again. He read every single line of the original financial ledgers he had kept from the late 90s. He meticulously compared his genuine numbers to the fabricated debt narrative Victor had violently forced down his throat. When he finally emerged from the study and walked into their living room, my mother stopped crying. She later told me she had not seen him stand with such rigid, terrifying posture since the days before his workshop collapsed. The heavy, suffocating shame that had weighed him down was completely gone, burned away by the undeniable, documented proof of his brother's absolute betrayal. My father realized he had never been weak. He had been exhausted, cornered, and maliciously deceived by the one person he was supposed to trust. He looked at my mother, kissed her forehead, and told her he was not going to hide anymore. He called me at exactly 9 o'clock that night and simply said we were moving forward. The anchor of guilt had finally snapped. With our family suddenly united, the final pieces of Mara's legal trap snapped firmly into place. The overwhelming pressure of the impending discovery phase began to break Victor's inner circle. The senior board member, terrified of facing federal prison time for signing fraudulent financial disclosures, officially broke ranks. His private attorney finalized an immunity agreement with Mara. He formally agreed to take the witness stand and testify under oath that Victor routinely and explicitly ordered the engineering department to alter the risk language in our predictive model reports to ensure the venture capital funding rounds were never jeopardized. Less than 24 hours later, our second crucial witness was secured. The night shift security guard, realizing Victor was actively preparing to throw him under the bus for the illegal office raid, signed a sworn affidavit. In exchange for ironclad whistleblower protection and guaranteed immunity from civil retaliation, he agreed to testify that the direct order to disable the surveillance cameras and physically bypass the electronic lock on my office door came straight from the office of the Chief Technology Officer. The trap was set, baited, and fully loaded. The presiding judge officially set the trial date for the second Tuesday of the following month. There would be no more delays, no more hidden arbitration, and no more sealed corporate settlements. The dispute was going into the public record. I spent the night before the trial organizing my suit and reviewing my own deposition notes. I looked at myself in the mirror, feeling a profound, unexpected sense of calm. The agonizing anxiety of losing my career had completely evaporated. I realized then that I was not walking into that courtroom tomorrow to win my old job back. I did not want to work at Northvale Meridian Systems ever again. I was walking into that room to take a massive pair of legal shears and cut the suffocating, fraudulent rope of debt that Victor had used to choke my family for 2 decades. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse swung open on the second Tuesday of the month, revealing a gallery packed so tightly that people were standing against the back wall. The air conditioning struggled against the body heat of local technology reporters, a dozen former colleagues from the engineering floor, and 3 rows of our extended family. These were the cousins and aunts who had spent 2 decades eating Victor's catered holiday dinners, nodding sympathetically whenever he lamented how much money he had poured into my father's empty pockets. They were here to watch the ungrateful niece get exactly what she deserved. Victor arrived at exactly 8:45 in the morning, flanked by a phalanx of legal sharks in custom Italian suits. He looked immaculate. He carried himself with the sorrowful grace of a benevolent patriarch forced to discipline a terribly wayward child. He smiled sadly at the extended family, placing a reassuring hand on a cousin's shoulder before taking his seat at the defense table. His lead attorney, a man with a voice like crushed velvet, opened the proceedings by attempting to paint me as a classic corporate opportunist. During his opening statements and my subsequent cross-examination, he relentlessly hammered the narrative of my unchecked personal ambition. He told the judge that I was furious about losing a promotion to a more qualified colleague. He claimed I had secretly planned to launch a competing analytics startup for over a year, and that I had fabricated this entire story about falsified data to mask my own theft of Northvale's intellectual property. According to the defense, I was not a whistleblower. I was a thief trying to extort my generous uncle for seed capital. Mara Ellison did not object. She sat perfectly still, letting them build their towering house of cards. When it was her turn, she did not immediately unleash our heaviest artillery. She approached the bench with the calm, terrifying precision of a surgeon. She started with the timeline. Mara introduced a sequential binder containing 52 internal emails, all completely verified by the emergency litigation hold. She projected my technical warnings onto the massive screen above the jury box, highlighting the exact dates and times I had begged the executive suite to halt the hospital deployment due to the critical 15% error rate. Then, she juxtaposed those desperate pleas with the finalized board presentations from 3 weeks later, where the failure rate had miraculously plummeted to less than 2%. She did not yell. She simply let the massive, undeniable discrepancy hang in the silent courtroom. Victor's lawyers scrambled, arguing that these were mere administrative streamlining choices, not deliberate fraud. They pivoted back to their main defense, loudly reminding the judge about the anonymous dossier claiming I had illegally downloaded those very same algorithms to steal them. That was the exact moment Mara called the night shift security guard to the witness stand. He walked up the aisle looking terrified, gripping the edges of the wooden stand as he swore the oath. But when Mara asked him about the events following the company dinner, his voice rang out clearly. He testified that on that specific Tuesday night, Victor and an outside contractor arrived at the main campus. He confirmed, under the absolute penalty of perjury, that the chief technology officer personally ordered him to disable the overhead surveillance cameras in the engineering sector and physically bypass the electronic lock on my office door. He described watching the contractor clone my physical backup drive. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The local reporters scribbled frantically. The defense's entire narrative of intellectual property theft completely collapsed. I had not taken the documents out. Victor had illegally broken in and copied them to frame me. Before Victor's lawyers could even attempt damage control, Mara called her next witness. The senior board member, sweating profusely and avoiding eye contact with the defense table, took the oath. Protected by his newly minted immunity agreement, he confessed everything. He testified that Victor routinely held closed-door meetings before quarterly reviews, explicitly instructing the board to soften the risk language in all predictive model reports. He admitted that Victor insisted on these alterations to ensure they did not spook the venture capital firms right before the Series C funding round, which was valued at over $40 million. The courtroom was dead silent. We had just established a clear, documented pattern of massive shareholder fraud. Victor's pristine facade finally began to crack. His jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching from 20 feet away. He leaned over, whispering furiously to his lead counsel, his face flushed with a dark, ugly red. He was losing control of his carefully curated reality. But Mara was not finished. Having destroyed his professional defense, she moved to expose the rotting foundation of his power. "Your Honor," Mara said, her voice cutting through the tension, "we have established the defendant's willingness to manipulate data and frame his own employees to maintain corporate control. We now submit into evidence Plaintiff's Exhibit F and Exhibit G to establish a historical pattern of this exact coercive behavior, directly establishing his motive for silencing my client." She held up the yellowed carbon copy of the original medical sensor buyout and the miniature audio cassette tape. Victor stood up so fast his heavy chair scraped loudly against the polished wood floor. His lawyers grabbed his arms, pulling him back down, but the panic in his eyes was absolute. He knew exactly what was on that tape. He knew the 20-year-old ghost he thought he had buried was standing right in the middle of the room. The defense frantically objected, citing relevance in the statute of limitations. Mara countered smoothly, arguing the evidence was not to prosecute the old crime, but to prove a continuous, ongoing pattern of familial extortion that culminated in the current wrongful termination. The judge, clearly intrigued by the rapidly escalating nature of the fraud, overruled the objection and admitted the evidence. "Call your next witness, counselor," the judge ordered. "The plaintiff calls Daniel Stewart to the stand," Mara announced. The gallery erupted into a low, frantic murmur. The extended family members leaned forward, their faces tight with confusion. For their entire lives, they had only known Daniel as the quiet, broken man who survived purely on his brother's charity. I could see the absolute certainty in their eyes. They fully expected my father to walk up there, apologize for my behavior, and beg the judge for leniency so his brother would not cut off his retirement funds. I watched my father stand up from the front row. He was wearing his best navy suit, the one he had saved for weddings and funerals. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at my mother, who was holding her breath beside him. As he walked past the defense table, Victor leaned back, adopting a posture of supreme, arrogant confidence. He gave my father a sharp, commanding look, the same silent order he had given him for 2 decades. It was a look that said, "Remember who owns you." Daniel stepped into the witness box and placed his hand on the Bible. As he sat down, he reached out and gripped the wooden railing of the stand. His knuckles were white, but his hands were not shaking. I looked into his eyes. The hollow, fearful exhaustion that had clouded his vision since my childhood was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, terrifying clarity. The storm had finally arrived. My father's steps toward the witness box were measured, his hands possessing a faint, barely perceptible tremor as he settled into the heavy oak chair. Mara Ellison approached the podium with a quiet reverence, allowing the sheer gravity of the moment to settle over the packed gallery. She did not begin with aggressive interrogations. Instead, she asked him to identify himself and explain the fundamental nature of his financial relationship with the defendant sitting just 15 feet away. "Mr. Stewart," Mara began, her voice steady and clear, carrying to the very back of the stifling room. "For 2 decades, your brother has publicly maintained a specific narrative regarding the acquisition of your medical sensor workshop. He claims he rescued you from total financial ruin. He claims he gave you and your family a second chance at life. Is that statement accurate?" Daniel did not answer the lawyer right away. He turned his head slowly, his posture rigid, and asked the judge for permission to address his brother directly. The judge, sensing the profound weight of the request, granted it with a curt nod. The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Every reporter, every estranged cousin, and every corporate lawyer froze in absolute silence. My father looked directly into Victor's eyes. Victor tried to maintain his mask of condescending pity, but the muscle ticking in his jaw betrayed his rising panic. "You did not save my family," my father said, his voice echoing with 20 years of suppressed agony finally breaking free. "You drowned us, and then you sold us the rope and called it mercy." The gallery erupted into a shocked murmur before the judge slammed his gavel, demanding immediate order. Mara stepped forward and presented the miniature audio cassette tape, asking Daniel to authenticate the recording. My father confirmed it was his device, his tape, and his brother's voice colluding with the loan officer to illegally accelerate his debt and force the hostile takeover. When Mara gently asked why he had kept this agonizing secret for so long, Daniel did not shy away from his own perceived failures. He spoke of the suffocating, compounding debt. He described the sheer terror of my mother's sudden illness, the crushing medical bills, and the profound, paralyzing shame of losing his life's work. Most importantly, he spoke of his constant fear that if he fought back, Victor would use his immense corporate leverage to ensure his children paid the ultimate price. He had traded his voice for our survival. Mara masterfully used this emotional confession as the final, unbreakable link in the chain. She turned to the judge and seamlessly connected the historical motive to the present corporate crime. Victor had spent his entire life manufacturing moral debts to trap people. He used that exact same playbook to steal my predictive AI architecture, force my silence, and construct a flawless scapegoat to cover up his deliberate manipulation of the hospital safety reports. When Victor was forced to take the stand for cross-examination, his polished veneer completely disintegrated. Confronted with the undeniable timeline of my technical warnings and the night shift security guard's testimony, Victor began to contradict his own sworn statements. He fumbled over the exact dates he allegedly learned about the software bugs. He stammered when asked to explain why a private forensic contractor was given executive clearance to bypass my electronic door lock at 2 o'clock in the morning. He tried to pivot, deflecting blame onto the board of directors, but the judge had heard enough. The judge leaned forward on the bench, sharply reprimanding Victor 3 separate times for actively dodging direct questions and attempting to mislead the court. The ruling, delivered late on a Friday afternoon, was a total, unmitigated devastation of Victor's empire. The judge granted almost all of our primary requests. I was awarded substantial punitive and compensatory damages for the tortious interference that had temporarily derailed my independent business opportunities. The court immediately struck down the draconian non-compete clause and the forced admission of guilt, declaring them entirely unenforceable and legally void. But the true victory was not financial. The judge formally ordered the entire dossier of falsified compliance reports, the forged buyout contracts, and the audio tape to be immediately transferred to the federal investigative agencies for criminal review. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. Before the courthouse doors even closed for the weekend, the Northvale Meridian Systems Board of Directors convened an emergency session. To protect themselves from the impending federal indictments, they immediately and publicly suspended Victor and Grant without pay. The internal audit rapidly expanded far beyond my predictive project, tearing into every single enterprise contract Victor had secured over the past 5 years using his sanitized data. His legacy was not just ruined, it was systematically dismantled. 6 months later, the suffocating shadow of the Northvale mansion felt like a distant nightmare. I opened the doors to my own independent venture, Cinder Row Analytics. I built my core engineering team not on forced loyalty or family ties, but entirely on raw merit, technical brilliance, and unyielding integrity. The venture capital fund that had previously canceled my pitch read the court transcripts and immediately returned to the table, fully funding our initial launch. The most profound shift, however, happened within my own family. Sunday dinners were no longer tense, quiet affairs dictated by the oppressive ghost of an unpaid debt. My parents, Daniel and Elaine, walked into my new apartment with a lightness I had never seen in them before. My father had returned to his workbench in the garage, sketching out new biometric sensor designs simply for the joy of creation. They were no longer the collateral damage of a corporate predator. They were just my parents. On the morning Cinder Row Analytics officially launched our first secure software deployment, I stood alone in my corner office before the rest of the team arrived. I looked out the massive glass window at the waking city, feeling a deep, abiding peace. I turned around and looked at the wall directly behind my desk. I had not framed my first major contract or my engineering degrees. Instead, mounted in a simple, understated black frame, was a certified copy of the court transcript from the day my father took the stand. I did not hang it there to nurture a lingering hatred for my uncle. I kept it there as a daily, grounding reminder of the fundamental truth we had fought so hard to reclaim. It stood as a permanent testament that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how delayed by fear or manipulation, possesses the miraculous power to save a life and completely alter the course of the future. The invisible chains were finally broken, and for the first time in 20 years, we were all finally breathing free air. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on how everything unfolded in the courtroom. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next one.